Oh, that was a perfect segue to my talk, and we didn't even prepare, so I'm shocked. So I've got to distill this hurricane season down to 12 minutes, which is going to be a challenge, to say the least. But before I do, I really want to go back 10 years to the original thought leaders on this concept, which I'm about to unpack for you. So if you go back even more than 10 years, Dr. Ed Rappaport, who's our acting director, along with James Franklin, had this concept that we needed a separate warning explicit for storm surge to help highlight the different response and the different areas impacted by these two phenomena. Ed had done a lot of work that the vast majority of deaths in hurricanes were from water, and the vast majority of those deaths were from salt water and storm surge. And he really felt strongly that we needed a strong push on the national level to begin bringing these deaths down. Similarly, Brock Long, who was the then Alabama EM director, he was the first person I called after I took this job, literally. And I asked him, what do you think? And his comments to me were quite clear and quite candid, and it's, you got to do something about these deaths from storm surge, Jamie. Enough's enough. So this was the original charge. This was the original vision. I put these words up here because I'm going to come back to it. This was the original challenge, is to bring down evacuations in unnecessary areas and cut the number of lives lost. So I want you to use that as your metric of success as I walk you through the season. Now, it takes an army, and in this case, it took a big army. At the time, it was just myself and one other contractor that was clearly not going to get it done. And so the first task, we had a vision in the charge from Ed. We had to start assembling the talent necessary to pull it off. And I can honestly say that those young people before you in that picture are the most talented and resilient individuals I've ever had the pleasure to work with. They went through a lot this season and never once complained. So let's look at the season. So we launched the Storm Surge Watch Warning operationally for the first time in the U.S. this hurricane season. First one out of the gate was Harvey. Relatively straightforward from a coastal perspective in that it went straight in, not straightforward from the inland flooding perspective. Then we had Irma, which basically went up the spine of Florida, lighting up both sides of the coast. This is a near worst case scenario from an evacuation perspective because you're forced to basically engage the entire state. Then we have Maria. Now I've bypassed Maria in Puerto Rico. I'm going to come back to that in a second. That's the Maria in the Outer Banks. And then finally, Nate over in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, when you pull back and look at the national perspective on this, you basically see that we lit the entire Gulf of Mexico up and a good chunk of the Mid-Atlantic. Nowhere in my plans for this year did I anticipate that sort of onslaught and test of a brand new warning system out of the gate. And I'm happy to report to you that we issued every single warning on time and delivered it successfully with no glitches. That's a remarkable success for something in its first year. All right, taking a step back even further, remember that our original charge from Ed and James and Brock was to cut the lives lost from storm surge. Now, these numbers are preliminary, and they're always subject to change, but as of right now, there are no known fatalities from storm surge originating from those 4 cyclones. Now, having a cyclone make landfall in the U.S. and not killing people from storm surge is not new. But having 4 back to back and not having a fatality from storm surge. Now, we can argue over what caused that. We can argue that it's luck, we can argue that it's chance, we can argue that it was geography. But you'd be hard pressed to convince me that that happened by itself. Somewhere along the way, this 10-year effort moved the needle. And that at least will be my argument. Now, the other argument, people will push back and say, well, these were low storm surge events. No. If you go back to the last big storm surge event we had before the new storm surge products came online, which would be Sandy. Sandy produced estimated peak inundation, so that's above ground level, that's above dirt, or over my head, inundation of 9 feet and took 41 lives. Look at these estimated peak inundation values. Harvey, 10, Irma, 10, Maria, 9, and Nate, 9 feet. These are all on par or similar to the storm surges we experienced in Sandy. Sandy took 41. These 4 collectively, thus far, took 0. And I'm going to come back in a second and talk about the evacuations, because a lot of people have argued, and I'm going to push back on this, is the only way we got that result is we basically evacuated everyone. And I'm going to come back and talk about that in a second. But let's talk about the first watch warning issued out of the gate, which was Harvey. So the bright pink is the warning, the lighter purple is the watch. This is the cumulative watch warning area for the entire event. The black numbers on there represent the peak observed values. And I put this on to point out a couple of things. If you look over here on the edges, right here, remember that our criteria for a warning is 3 feet. Look at this warning butting right up against 2.9 and 2.8. There were a lot of arguments in the early days that a storm surge watch warning is good, but the skill and prediction is not there to support it. That's a pretty overwhelming graphic. And then even if you look on the south side, you're not getting this huge over warning that a lot of people thought would be achieved with the first round or the first issuance. So I was incredibly pleased with this early success. Now, this season would be remiss without talking about the shelter in place at the Hurricane Center and various other WFOs. We felt it in no uncertain terms. Those are the shutters coming down on the National Hurricane Center, and I'm going to tell you, when that last sliver of blue disappeared, you knew it was real. There was a cold chill that would run up your back when that door went down for it. There's my house all shuttered up. We lived it. We all experienced it. If it looks dark, that's because the shutters went up at night. Take a guess what we're doing during the day. We're giving briefings, making forecasts. So you really only have a chance to shutter up your house at nighttime. There's my bed under my desk. If it looks like a cold, hard floor, it was. But I can honestly say I think I slept better on that cold, hard floor those 3 nights than I did any of the rest of the season. Having your coworkers there next to you was just an incredibly comforting and safe feeling. You knew that someone had your back and they were 5 feet away. You can see the shutters up. You can see people just making tents and stuff. And I was out walking around, and the cat, the expression on the cat's face, I think, summarized how we all felt. He was none too happy with the experience, and I'm happy to report the cat survived the storm. He was out and about soon thereafter, just like everyone else. Challenges. We are still very much a deterministic community. We are continue to view the world through a deterministic lens, even though there's been great progress of the hurricane products to probabilistic or scenario-based approaches. So I'm showing you this to help prove that. This is a forecast of Irma right before landfall, and then a hindcast. So the hindcast is after it's made landfall. You know all the parameters, you know the track, you know the intensity, what have you. And what strikes you about this image? It's a very, very, very subtle shift in track makes a massive difference in storm surge. Deterministic approaches for high impact events like this just don't work. They do not convey the uncertainty, and if worst case scenarios, they imply a level of safety which isn't there. So we heard a lot of this after Irma, that people were struggling to understand our probabilistic products because they were attempting to still view it from a deterministic perspective. So that's my challenge to this community, is I still think we have a long ways to go with expressions of uncertainty and communicating uncertainty. We've started to move the needle, but we've got a ways to go yet. Now, remember the original challenge was to cut the lives lost and reduce evacuation. So these are some numbers provided to us by Miami-Dade County. I need to help you with this for a second. How many of you know that we evacuate in this nation because of storm surge? Well, got some work to do. So storm surge mapping and risk done by NOAA is provided to emergency managers. They produce these scenarios and maps, so-called zones. These zones are often lettered A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then when a storm comes, everything is already, they know how many people, how many cars, how many shelters, how long it takes, the transportation analysis, it takes 30 hours. Everything is sort of set in motion. So when an actual storm comes along, we're talking which zones. So if you run a Cat 5 scenario, using their Cat 5 scenarios, in the absence of these storm surge products, they would have been looking at evacuating somewhere between 1.2 to 2 million people, 1.2 being the best case scenario, 2 being the worst. They ended up evacuating 650,000 people. That's a pretty good number. And think back to John's talk, the level of anxiety that was happening at the time. Think about this. People were really, really, really scared. And to keep a city and hold them back and say, hang on, hang on. This is a remarkable accomplishment. Now, if you feel like I'm cherry picking this, here are the words of Brian Kuhn, who was the then Florida Department of Emergency Management director. The storm surge warnings during Irma allowed Florida officials to more precisely determine the scope and timing of evacuation decisions. This reduced the potential for over-evacuation, reduced traffic, and consequently the amount of fuel used during a period of reduced availability. For those that don't know, fuel is a big, 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 big issue in a hurricane. You run out of it, people stranded on the roads, wandering around, it becomes a big, big deal. And so by keeping too many people off the roads, reducing that strain on the fuel capacity and keeping the roads moving is what he's saying is it's allowing the process to move quickly. And does anybody remember the scenes during Irma like we saw in Rita? Just wall to wall traffic jammed for hours and hours and not moving. We didn't see any of that. Now, certainly there were traffic problems. I don't want to dismiss that, but nothing like what we saw in the case of past storms. And then there was Maria. Now, I alluded to earlier, I had to circle back to this. At the time, in 2017, we hadn't yet done storm surge watches and warnings for Oconus, that's Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, and Hawaii. Come to one of our future talks and we'll talk about what we're doing to fix that. But they did have these scenario-based maps that I talked about in the earlier one. There's us, the Hurricane Center staff down there training PREMA before the season on how to use these maps. There are the maps laid out before you so you can see them. They had these scenario-based maps and they helped them to guide the evacuation process. So while we don't yet have the storm surge watch warning down there yet, we've got early strides and successes on the way. Now, to finish us up here, this to me, what our customers say are the ultimate way to grade yourself. The National Weather Service's new storm surge watches and warnings provide the emergency management community with a significant service enhancement for protecting life, property, and protecting us from the historically largest loss of the deadliest part of a hurricane. So I argue that we had a good start. We got a long ways to go. But before I end, we talk a lot about the whats or the hows at this conference. We're using social media with new models enhancement, data assimilation. We ought to also remind ourselves of the why sometimes, because the why is what binds us together as a community. These are two photographs I took in the Irma post-storm assessment, where you go down and sort of review the damage and try to estimate the surge. And look at that trailer sort of wrapped around the pole of the building. The whole entire bottom floor of the building was basically gutted. And when you talk to residents and you ask them why they evacuate, and they reference a map or a product or something they heard, boy, I'm not an emotional person, but that'll do you in pretty quick. And I think we can all relate to this Pooh Bear that got swept out of the house and left on the floor, or left on out in the street. And while I have no idea if this Pooh Bear was reunited with its owner, I know the owner lived. And that, to me, is why we all do this. So thank you so much for your time.